Alright, so as you know, the number one key to realistic drawing is all in the shading. That's what gives your drawing that three-dimensional look. And there's basically two parts to shading. The first is to know what the different tones are, how dark they are, and where to place them in your drawing. And the second part is the skill of being able to actually put pencil to paper and create those tones in your drawing, and to do it in a smooth and gradual way as possible. And that's something we're going to cover in future lessons. But in this video, I just want to talk about what the different tones are and where to place them in your drawing. When it comes to shading, there's something called the 5 elements of shading. What they are is basically 5 different shadows that you use when you shade your drawing. So let's go over what they are and the role that they play in making this sphere look three-dimensional. We'll go from darkest to lightest. First, we have the cast shadow, and it corresponds to this area right here on the sphere. It's outside of the sphere, and it's over here on the second one. And that's the reason it's called cast shadow, is because it's the shadow that the object casts when light is shown on it. So in this example, the light source is right here, and when it hits the object, it casts a shadow on the opposite direction. On this one, the light source is a bit higher, so the shadow is not as long as this one, it's more closer to the object. And this is the darkest tone you're going to have in your drawing. So you should try to make it as close to black as possible. And it corresponds to this square right here on the value scale, the darkest one on the spectrum. Next, we have the shadow edge, and it's this curved crescent right there near the edge of the sphere. This is what gives the sphere its rounded look. You notice it's the gradual transitioning between the light tone and the dark tone that create that illusion that the sphere is curving and gives it the 3D look. It's actually the darkest shadow that's on the object itself, and the value it has is dark gray, and it corresponds to this box right there on the value scale. Notice, by the way, that it's the furthest part of the sphere that is away from the light. So wherever the light is, it sort of formed this round half circle around where the light hit the object. Okay, and next we have the halftone, and it's this area right here. It's also sometimes referred to as the middle tone, and it's basically the transition between the dark shadow's edge and the full light area. It's the part in between. And the interesting thing about the halftone is that if this was a color drawing, so if this sphere was, say, a blue ball, then the halftone would be the true color of that ball, whereas the shadow's edge would be sort of a darker blue because it's cast in shadow. The halftone would be the true color, unaffected by any light or darkness. And the value it has is medium gray, and it corresponds to this box right there. Next, we have the reflected light, and this part is interesting. It's this rounded band of light right on the edge of the sphere, and it's created because the light from the light source hits the surface that the sphere is sitting on and then bounces back onto the sphere. So the light goes like that, then it reflects onto the sphere, creating this ring of light around it. And it's a very subtle detail, but it does a lot to add an extra dimension to the sphere. It gives it that extra bit of realism. And this is the one thing that a lot of beginners miss when they begin drawing. So make sure you include it in your drawing, because it does make a big difference. The value that it has is light gray, and it corresponds to this box right there. And lastly, we have the full light, and it's this area right here. That's where the light hits the object directly, and it's the brightest part on the sphere. It corresponds to this box right here, which is just white. You just leave it blank. Some artists like to shade in the full light and make it a tad bit gray because they don't want to show the white of the paper. That's just a matter of preference. Some people think it looks better that way. This particular sphere, I just left it white. You can play around with that and see which one you like better. The one advantage of shading in the full light area and making a little bit gray is that you have an extra level of whiteness to play with. So if there was some spot that you wanted to make pop, then you could erase and let that be the white of the paper. And that's it. Those are the 5 elements of shading. You notice they're pretty easy to remember. You just think, okay, there's the light source. The full light is where the light hits the object directly. And as it moves out from that area, it gets gradually darker. So first you have the halftone, and then you get to the shadow edge, and then you have the reflected light, and then lastly you got the cast shadow. Okay. If you look at any portrait drawing, or any drawing for that matter, you'll be able to see these 5 elements at work, and it's the key positions of these 5 different tones and their gradual blending of them together that gives the drawing its realistic look. And we'll talk more about how these 5 different tones play in portrait drawing later on, but for now let's just focus on what they do in the sphere. So now that you know what the tones are, your homework assignment for this lesson is to go around your house and just observe different objects and see if you can spot the 5 different elements of shading in those objects. See where you see if you can see where the shadow edge is, or the cast shadow, or the reflected light, and so on. And that's going to train your brain to think in terms of these shadows. And then once you've done that, I'd like you to try to create your own value scale and try to match these tones as closely as you can. That's going to train your eye to think in terms of these tones, and also train your hand to shade them. One tip when you're doing this exercise, I'm going to include a picture of this grayscale below, so you can print it out and have it with you when you're doing the exercise. But one tip when you're doing this exercise is to be very careful around the lighter area, because that's where you need to exercise the most control. The dark area is easy. You can just press down harder, or go over it multiple times to make it darker. But the light area is where you need to really lighten your touch and make sure you're not pressing down too hard. With the light gray in particular, don't feel like you have to shade in the entire box. With this one I didn't. I simply keep my touch very light, and I just sort of put in a thin layer of graphite. I didn't shade it all the way. I just sort of half fill the box with my shading, and then I used the Tortolon to spread the graphite out and blend it together to create a smoother look. And that's what you can do with this one. Okay, we'll talk more about how to use the Tortolon in the next video. The main point of this exercise is just to get you used to the 5 elements of shading and also the different tones. Okay, so go ahead and do those exercises right now, and I'll see you in the next video.